Excellent. Jez Anderson from NetX, the floor is yours. Please let us know. Operations, is it the new learning development? Jez, over to you.
Well, hello everybody. Thanks for giving me some time. I hope the next 45 minutes, 50 minutes or so is going to be of some stimulation. I'm not going to say I'm going to provide you with lots of new insight or anything new. I'm no soothsayer. What I am though is someone that's spent quite a lot of my life around the world of learning and development. So I've worked in L&D for over 30 years now, in lots of different guises, as Donald said before. And that my key role at the moment, and has been for the last 5 or 6 years, has been supporting organizations who are engaging in digital transition, I suppose is a way to think about it. Those people who have taken the step, which has obviously increased enormously in the last couple of years, towards digital enablement of their learning. So what I'm going to do today is just share with you a recent project that I've been working on, probably for the last 12-18 months, personally, and as part of my role with NetX. And I can't mention the client's name, unfortunately, due to lots of other reasons, which I'm sure you all understand. But it's shall we say it's a large global retailer, online retailer. And we'll leave it at that. So what I'd like to share with you today is the case study, and this is a case study that I have worked with and shared on a few occasions in the last few months. And to be honest, the last time I did this, I got a question, and the question from the audience was the title of this thing: Are ops the new L&D? And to be truthful, I couldn't answer it. I thought, oh, that's a really, really good question. I hadn't even thought about that context when I prepared the deck, when I did the presentation. It was much more about learning design than it was about who was owning the training. So when I was talking to Donald about this webinar today, I was thinking, well, what can we do that's interesting? And I thought, well, actually, maybe if I share the deck with you, give you an opportunity to have a think and to talk through it. I will talk through what we've done. I'll talk through our story. I'll give you a sense of the journey that we've been on with this client. But ultimately, I'm really interested for us to have a conversation about it, be it through chat. But I'm really interested just to get your perspective on what your experiences are around this topic, because I do think there is a fundamental change happening. I'm seeing it more with not just this one client, but with more clients, and learning becomes much more enabled, and individuals' expectations around learning is changing. So let's just start. I'll just quickly run through the case study, if you like. And it started back in 2019 for NetX, before I was working with them. And it was classic learning technologies conversation. Somebody came up to the stand, had a conversation. Or this is how the story goes internally. However the fable is, this is how it happened. Somebody come up to the stand, had the conversation. They said, basically, our training isn't giving us what we want. It's not delivering what we need. Can you help us? Great opening line, opportunity for somebody. So what we did then was just started to have that conversation with them, and it soon became clear what the issue was. The issue was ultimately that this is a fast-moving business, that it has had massive growth, truly exponential growth, in the last few years, from its inception, really. And in terms of the scaling up that was going on within the business, in terms of the numbers of people working within the business in the different roles that they were having, the growth was exponential. And therefore, the traditional standard training approaches which they were adopting, which was internally owned, a lot of classroom-based briefings, presentations, that sort of thing, wasn't going to be enough. So clearly they wanted to move digital. And now what that was against, and this was coming from the operations part of the organization. This wasn't driven by learning and development. And that was the contact, as we found out. The contact was from an ops perspective and not from an L&D perspective. When we dug a little bit deeper into it, it was found that the learning background to it was quite disorganized. It become content heavy, that it was very difficult to navigate. And although there was lots and lots and lots of content there, it had no central spine. It had no body holding it together. It was just content, and it was being served through a system which didn't really work for the operations part of the organization. And so our challenge was to try and help them understand what their problem was, and to try and come up with some sort of solution which was going to work. So ultimately what we came up with them, in partnership with them, was a clear problem statement. And I think this is the starting point of the journey. And maybe, as I go through it now and I reflect on it, maybe this is some of the things that, from a learning and development perspective, we need to think about and consider. And do we do this, and do we do this effectively, or are we driven much more by content? Are we driven much more by the need to try and create lots and lots of learning for people and try and find fancy ways to host it, etc., etc.? So,
Jez, can I just interrupt for a second?
Sure.
People are beguiled by your storytelling. Nobody said anything so far in the chat. I just want to let everybody know you're very happy for me to interrupt you if people bring things up in the chat. But you also sort of mentioned a question there. You were alluding to the fact that are we changing? Are we doing something different in learning and development? I just want to invite people to give their reflections on whether they think we're moving away from a content-focused way of work to something else. So I'll just invite people to do that, drop their thoughts into the chat. If something pops up, I may interrupt you. Otherwise, the chat discussion may continue on its own as well.
Right.
I'm going to hand it back to you, Jez.
Great. Thanks, Donald. And that's great. Yeah. And so anyone does have any points, that to raise, as I say, this is my experience, this is my story. So where we were was we came up with a problem statement, which was a good place to start. It was a good part of understanding exactly where they were. We weren't diving into a solution, which was number one. We weren't diving into this is the answer. We were very clear with them that if they wanted to understand what it was that they were trying to achieve, we needed to understand it. So they were very much in the mind that they wanted something different but didn't know what it was. So these are the key things that we came up with. Was they wanted a learning system that was capable of delivering up-to-date effective e-learning to a large audience, diverse audience of learners. Time efficiency, consistency across a wide portfolio of e-learning, logical, replicable, scalable method for both learning and content management. So, in some ways quite wide, but also for us quite a nice focus in terms of these are the measurables. These are the things that we as a supporting organization can provide them. So it was a good starting point for us. What that led to. So in some ways, what we started to do then was decide on the what's. And it was very much about recognition that they were moving away from something. So it wasn't so much about pulling towards, it was pushing away from what their status quo was. And they wanted to move quickly away from that. They felt that their processes were over centralized. They felt that they had too much content, that there wasn't enough pace required within it to meet the operational business needs. And it didn't reflect the culture of their organization. Their organization is very fast moving. It's high levels of customer orientation, and they just didn't believe that their training services were providing that. So hence them taking ownership, hence them wanting to own it and take it for themselves, which they did. So this is the what's. In some ways, these are the what statements that we produced with them. So the next phase on from once we understood what the problem was, we wanted to just to filter that down a little bit further. It was operationally requirement led, so it was very clearly focused on the ops part of the business. It wasn't wider than that. It was tangibly focused on the operations part of the organization. They needed to reflect localized provision. So although there was a clear sense of centralization, they also needed to ensure that it was localized, and I'll get to the sense of why that in a minute. Large, complex learner population at many levels. So from quite a a base individual contributor level to management level. So it needed to reflect that. Operations business led in terms of the solution. So the solution was to be commissioned by their internal structure. It had to be an independent platform solution and a business commissioning structure itself. So there had to be an internal client operation model, so a way for them to sustain it for themselves. And then ultimately it was about building a one-stop shop for e-learning development, which people could access when and how they wanted. So in some ways it was quite a modern problem, and it was quite a big topic for us, but it involved in partnership, very clearly in partnership with them as a client. Although they didn't quite understand what it was they wanted, they didn't come along and say, we want a platform, we want the platform to do X, Y, and Z. We need X number of content, we need it to look like this. It was very much because they didn't have the expertise, they didn't have the knowledge. It was very much about this is how they wanted to do it. So in partnership with them, that's where the scoping came from. The why, and I think it's probably important to understand why. Geographic reach of this organization was at the time and has grown since then, but was currently around 21 countries, so including LATAM, EU, APAC, and ME. Now moving into North America, so massive geographical reach. We're talking around at least, last year's target was 80,000 learners. It's gone up to 100,000, so it hit over 100,000 learners by the end of 2023, with 110,000 learning challenges or pieces of e-learning completed each month. And again, that was last year's statistics, so that's gone up as well. So we're talking about a program which has got global massive reach, and it's about how do we manage everybody's needs within that. So you can see it's not a small problem, it's not a small issue, and from a client's point of view, clearly what they wanted to do is they wanted to own that as much as they possibly could themselves. So we understood the scale, we understood what it was that they wanted to do, we understood the why behind it. The next thing for us was to start to think about how we were going to deliver it. So again, in consultation with themselves, we sat down and we agreed a set of measurable expectations around it, which have defined the working processes from that point forward. And so these SLAs exist between us. We've set up clear lines of accountability and responsibility within the project. Everybody knows what their roles are, and that's supported both in process and in documentation and systems that are in place as a result. So they were clear that they wanted the platform to be reliable and stable. They wanted us to be able to respond to and adapt to multiple ever-increasing content. They operationally led reflecting business need first. It wasn't about some wider organizational agenda. It was very much about how do we make sure that we can be as effective as we can be and do the job that we need to do as quickly and as efficiently as possible. And training content to cover essential knowledge of all operational delivery as defined by themselves and not by external people. So in some ways, it was very much about how do we help them, how do we empower them to create a program which delivers to the massive population they have, to the multiple audiences they have, with the amount of needs that they have, which are all different. So the solution. I'm not here to sell. I'm not here to sell NetX. I'm not here to sell the platform. Although, of course, if you're interested, then give us a shout. But what we ended up doing, and I think this is the interesting thing for me, which is sort of an evolution that I've seen in terms of how we support organizations, is that it's not just about looking at a platform and looking at content independent and in isolation of each other. It was starting to think about the whole thing together and how does one support the other. And this isn't new. This is, the whole ecosystem thinking has been around for quite a long time. It's, I've talked about it over the years. Other providers talk about it. I don't call it an ecosystem. For me, it's about synergies. It's about creating synergies between the content delivery, the methodology, the philosophy, if you like, the culture, the learning culture of an organization, and making sure that the platform delivers that. How often have I spent time working on a content project and spent a lot of time developing and devising a project which is going to meet learner expectations and meet needs, to put it onto a host which then doesn't fulfill that and can't fulfill that. And that was one of the things that was one of the principles of this project, was to make sure that the content that we developed fitted with the platform and fitted with the learner experience that they wanted. Now, the approach that we adopted...
Jez, can I just...
Sure.
A few questions have come up which are really interesting, and I'd like to just because it is relevant on the story, I think, I'd like to just, before we jump into the solution part of it, Linda raised a great question, which I'm going to come back to later on. There's a really interesting question from Wendy. I'm interested to know why they required an independent platform from the corporate training. So why couldn't they just use something that they already had? Or
I don't want to name names.
Yeah.
But shall we say it was one of the larger enterprise systems that the organization has? And I think that had sort of become driven by wider HR resourcing needs and requirements. And I think that took primacy over learning. I think it had also become, and this was their words, it had become a bit of a dumping ground for content. And people, I would say it was almost a bit of a, anyone could create content, anyone could put content in there, all the businesses could do that. And then all of a sudden it became unmanageable. It got to a point where no one could work out how to use it.
A fairly classic problem of something being stifled because the garden hadn't been weeded properly, it hadn't been looked after properly, and so there was just too much there, and you couldn't see what there was, and it wasn't being. Maybe it was a great system initially, but it wasn't being used well. Okay.
Yeah. So, I think what it is for me was that thing that it lacked a strategic purpose. It lacked the content didn't have structure. The content, and to be truthful, where we're headed next is the content still probably doesn't have as much structure as it could have in terms of program structure, in terms of learning pathways and curricula. It lacks some of what I would probably class as learning science. It's and that's about maybe it's about the maturity of the client. It's a very fast growing business, relatively speaking. They haven't developed the learning processes and systems maybe as effectively as organizations which have been around a lot longer.
And possibly also this relates to the role of the learning and development department and its role in, where possible, leading and fostering a culture of learning, so people understand it's more than just about dumping content in front of people. Andy Gilbert says SharePoint/Teams dumping ground ? We're not going to say anything about any particular platform, but we've all seen, I think, examples of platforms which have been dumping grounds, and we know that doesn't work. And then somebody's responsibility to make sure that that doesn't happen. And I think it's the L&D departments. But we can come back to that later on when we're doing the questions and answers at the end. Jez, just one other question here from Andy, which was this a learning problem or a knowledge and process platform to support workflow? So,
and I'd like to pick up, because I think that's a really good question.
It is, yeah.
Because I think it initially it was a learning flow. It was about content management. It was about recognition, and that's the mindset that they brought to the problem, if you like, because they're ops. They still don't really get learning.
Yeah,
they're ops people, and even the people who are responsible now for it, and with a small team, relatively small team, who are driving the project forward, all come from an operational background. None of them come from a learning background. So their primacy is about applying operation thinking to the learning process. So it's definitely knowledge and not about learning.
So there's a role there. There's a role there for learning, isn't there?
Absolutely.
All right.
Yeah, and that's sort of where I'm headed. Is the fact is actually the role that we're playing in that is what realistically internal learning partners should be playing now. But it's
I'm not going to press that point, because I know we'll come to that later on. I'm going to let you get back to the story, and I'm going to turn my camera off. But please keep the thoughts and the questions and the comments coming. Jez, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Back to the session.
Okay, so I'm not going to talk much about the actual solution itself. The interesting way, and it alludes back to this thing about being ops driven, is where we ended up, and where we still got is that a lot of the content goes through what has been titled by NetEx and by the client, the content factory, and that's how it feels, and that's how it is. Now that is going to deliver a particular type of approach. So it's very templated, it's very uniform, it's quite dull, you know. And I'll be quite honest, and I've told this to my client, to my colleagues, it's quite dull. It's very functional and it does what it needs to do. It gives people the knowledge. How effective it is at creating change and embedding that knowledge, not quite sure. They do some evaluation, but it's not particularly effective evaluation. So there's an awful lot of work still to do on this, which is probably takes us to well, I'll call about phase 1 first and then phase 2. So phase 1 was all about platform stability and building out a curriculum, be it curriculum with a small c, really, because it's not really what I would call a program or a curriculum, but it's a body of knowledge which makes sense and can be accessed. So learners know where it is, they know what they've got to do, they can access it, they can do it, it can be recorded that they've done it. So managers know what's happened, they know where people are, and then you can start to look at some basic impact sort of measurement in terms of, have people done it? Are we meeting our standards in the warehouses, in the distribution centers, etc., that we need to do. So yes, there is some basic measures to that, and we've got a platform which works and delivers. So that was fine. That took us to the end of 2022. In 2023, so we've been around for what, 4 years at this point. They then started to think, okay, what we're getting feedback back that people love the fact that they can get the content. They love the fact they know where it is. They love the fact that it's actually relevant to their jobs. But, and this is the big but, we need to make sure that it remains focused on the needs of the customer and not about us. So that's a primary goal for going forward. But we need to innovate. We need to look at how do we innovate and how do we create increased expansion for the platform, because there's other people interested in joining into that. So when we looked at that, it was starting to think, okay, so they're interested particularly on innovation and particularly on expansion. The customer success is sort of a, they have to, I won't say they have to say that, but it's a given realistically within the context of their environment. But innovation and expansion were key. Expansion's happening, so expansion is happening because the platform's successful and it's proven and it's tested. And there's lots of positive feedback around the platform from both managers and from users' perspective. The bit where they were really focused on, and the bit that's missing, was the whole concept of innovation and how do we innovate this content. So where we ended up was starting to think of differently, we started to question them differently about how they were structuring their thinking around learning. So how were they starting to look at it beyond just core knowledge and skill, which is probably where we were? How do we move towards the nature achieving mastery, which was one of their goals, which was one of their key goals going forward? And how do we ensure that practice, feedback, experience, and consolidation happen within it? So in some ways, what we started to do with them is start to think about different ways of doing learning, different approaches to doing learning. So it became both a combination of formal and informal. We were starting to think about how do you create more community-based learning, more social-based learning. How do you create more so people, more just in time, reflecting some of the shifts and changes that are going on certainly within the technical industry and learning technologies, and also then building that into a more strategic approach to how they deliver. So we started to build this out and we started to think with them, which is probably where I would have expected this is where I would expect a learning and development organization to come in. And this is the bit where, in some ways, I think what we're doing as an outside provider is the bit that realistically an L&D team should be doing, which raises the question: is operations a new L&D? Well, yes and no. I mean, yes, they are potentially. They're doing some of the work that we traditionally might have done in this context, in this example, but they still miss an element, and they still miss the element of, are they capable? Do they have the knowledge to understand what it means to bring a strategic program together of learning? Can they create curricula and program? Can they create learning pathways that make sense? Are they able to look at different approaches to creating learning, building learning, designing learning, and delivering that in a way which meets a big range of learners? So all the issues which are part of day-to-day modern learning, workplace learning and development, they don't necessarily have. But they do recognize that they want to develop and they want to change. And if they're going to innovate, if they're going to create that, there's a recognition that they want to do this work. And we're now starting to talk to them about learning strategy, which is quite interesting. So when I started working with them about 18 months ago, I remember my first meeting with them, and I boldly offered the suggestion that they were missing a learning strategy. And I was told that, well, learning and development people don't really work very well in our business, so we haven't really got one. And I don't think we need one, sort of thing. Now we're starting to shift. We're starting to say, actually, we do. There's a recognition that we need to be more strategic, because we risk creating the same problems that we had before with the old system. We risk becoming a bit of a content dumping ground, be it content that we're managing, but it's still expanding rapidly. There's lots of learning content in there. We now need to manage that. We need to own that and understand how that's going to work. So there is, there's a new problem, if you like. There's a new problem in mind. So that raises the question with them. It's raised the question with me. I'm just going to pause a little minute and just see, Donald, is there any questions or things that people have popped up that we want to pick up at this point?
There's a really interesting discussion going on around the role of L&D, and we're going to get to that at the end, which is, look, is our role about producing content? The answer, everyone is saying no. We need to be doing other things, such as moving ourselves towards being consultants and in trying to make the culture about learning experience and measuring impact. And I think we'd agree with that. So let's get to that at the end, Jez. I think it's a really good series of conversations going on. A couple of points around the systems that you had or that were extant. So what happened to the original systems that they had? Was that still there? And do you have therefore two systems running in parallel? That was a question from sorry, I can't remember who it's from. I'm on my laptop, so I've less real estate in front of me, but that was a key question. And then there was a second question that went with that, which is, well, Phil says, having multiple LMSs has its own problems. I'd be interested to hear how you distinguish between what is stored where and how you direct people to the right platform. So yeah, I think it's a platform thing that's really important. Any points on that, Jez?
Okay, so in terms of the platforms, yes, they do. The organizationally sponsored platform of enterprise system of name who shall not be mentioned still exists,
right?
And the content is still there. And maybe they're operating a meritocracy, and ultimately, if whatever's good rises to the top and the rest of it gets discarded, I don't know. So that is still there and it still operates. I'm honest,
Jez, sure. Quick question. Very often what would happen there is that legacy system, for want of a better word, would be the place where compliance training was done, and the other system would be where more operationally important support work would be done. Is that what's happening, or have I got that wrong?
It's a very good question, and to be truthful, I don't know the answer to it. There's some of the content that is on the platform that we work with them on is of compliance by nature, right. But it's not classic,
mandatory
health and safety,
stuff,
mandatory stuff. That I'm assuming is still owned by the central system. Interestingly, we have nothing to do with the central L&D. this project has nothing to do with central L&D.
Wow.
We don't have conversations with the central L&D team, although we are starting to have conversations about the platform that we've created with North America now, which is sort of starting to raise some of the conversations.
That's
with
fascinating.
central.
You've answered the question Linda had, which is, well, what happened to the original L&D department? Do they still exist? They do. They're central, but you have effectively two systems, processes, and provision running in parallel here. Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. Exactly.
Wow.
Okay. So in terms of going to the LMS and using the LMS as a management tool, the ops team use the platform. I don't want to use the name because I might get into trouble.
Yeah.
But the platform that we've created, the ops team use that for their management information around who's done what from an operational compliance perspective. So it is generating data. It's generating the sort of data they need to understand in terms of, it is classic LMS data. It's, who's done what, when did they do it, how long did it take to do it, that sort of stuff. We're not in the world of great data analytics yet with them, but that's
and realistically, that is actually where most people are. Some great comments, some great references here, pointing people towards Julie Dirkson's book. We've got Julie Dirkson talking on a panel at Learning Technology. So I'm just going to drop the link into Julie's book here. I'm going to let you get back to
Oh, have I gone? I hope I'm not gone.
In the end about the role of L&D, but sorry, go on.
No, I thought you just paused there, Donald. I thought it might be my end, so I was just
no,
hoping it wasn't.
We're all fluent. I'm going to drop off, let you carry on, Jez, and then let's get to this discussion about, okay, so what are we doing? Who's in charge?
So you'll be pleased to know I've only got a couple of slides left, really. So the story is nearly complete because we're nearly at the point where we are now, which is we're working with them to start to think about learning differently. In fact, that was some of the questions that we've been having in the last couple of weeks. How do they start to think and structure their learning differently? And we're starting to look at some of the detailed program elements. So lean, for example, as you can imagine, an organization which is all about logistics, it ultimately lean's a big topic. And it's become a little bit of a beast. It's become a little bit out of control. So we're now starting to use that as an opportunity to start to talk about how do we bring some structure to that? How do we bring some strategy to that approach, which still delivers the needs, still delivers what they want to do, but in a way which is more manageable and is going to work long term, is going to be more sustainable for them as an organization. Just as a background, and this is something that I wasn't sure if I was going to keep in the deck or not, but I just thought I'd just share. I don't talk about this framework with them, but for me, this is a really useful framework that I have in the back of my mind when I'm talking about their transformation. So it's based on a digital transformation model, but ultimately I sort of adopt it when I'm thinking about digital, but also when I'm thinking about learning. So I just find it a really useful framework. And so when I'm working with them, this is what's in my head. Which of these segments am I working in, and where are we headed? Ultimately, what I'm trying to do and where we are headed is much more towards organizational digital culture. So it's about, in some ways, it's about without ever saying the words, because I don't think if I said the words to them, they'd probably run away. But it is about learning organization. It's about digital learning organization. Now, how do we support them as this ops team become a digital learning organization in their own right? At the moment, I would suggest an operations learning function, but they're not a learning organization. So it's about enabling and equipping them. And that's what we're doing. So we're working with their teams. We're helping them upskill. We're helping them with their capability and understanding. And we're helping them provide them with some structure. So it's very much about advice, about guidance, about facilitation. So in some ways, I took 3 words away from this in terms of what I'm thinking around. So it's about equipping them, it's about engaging them, and it's about empowering. And it's how do we not? I mean, obviously, that's about the learner, but equally for me, it's about this organization. So equipping them to be able to do it, to deliver learning which is effective, engage them as a learning organization themselves, and empower them to drive things forward in a way which is going to work for them. Wider reflections. So probably getting to the point of asking some questions really, and getting some more discussion. These are the thoughts I've took away when I sat and thought about the question from the chap who asked me, are ops the new L&D? Learning and development don't own learning. And, you know, after 30 odd years of experience in the sector, if I totally get that, that we're about enablement and empowerment. We're not about owning it. We might have been at one point, but technology has released us from that responsibility as far as I'm concerned. We are now about how do we support and drive learning within organizations. It's become much more strategic as a function, as a result, and enables it empowers us to be freer to support learning as itself. Organizations are achieving digital maturity now. We talked for a long time about digital maturity and what that looked like. But that comes with a cost, and that comes with a changing level of expectation and behavior, both of people like the ops team that I've been working with, but equally from a learner's point of view, is how do we ensure that individuals and organizational learning reflects digital maturity of the individuals and the business as a whole. Content is everywhere, as we know, and that's not going to change. That's not going away. You know, AI is here to stay. It will become increasingly more sophisticated and more effective. So it isn't about, it's so much more about how now as opposed to what. And I think my role as an L&D professional is to help people with the how question. So how do they support learning better? How do they structure their learning? How do they structure their content? How do they deliver that to individuals? How do they make sure that the right content gets to the right people? How do they make sure that it's measured and seen as impactful, so they can help corral and curate that content in the most appropriate way? It's about working in sync. This has become really clear for me that if you're out of sync with your key operational stakeholders, then you know the reality of it is you will be potentially become redundant to them. They will look elsewhere. They'll draw the line of least resistance between what they want and where they are. Savvy operational managers want learning. They recognize the value of learning, and they want to work to support their teams deliver it. And they don't want to be encumbered by systems and processes that don't work for them. And this is a case. There's a case for L&D to think differently and challenge its own sense of role and responsibility within organizations if it's not already doing so. And I've worked with a lot of good colleagues who get this and who work hard and are constrained by existing systems and processes, constrained by existing policies and approaches and relationships and cultures. So there's a lot of work. You know, I'm not saying it's an easy fix, but it is certainly something that I think as L&D, our role and responsibility has shifted dramatically, and especially so in the last few years. So, Donald, question time. There's 4 questions here. I suppose what I'd like to do is, if rather than try and answer all 4 at once, because that's probably impossible, let's just start at the top one and see what, Donald, any thoughts from you or what other people have to say, and then take it from there.
I love the idea that you think it might be possible to answer 4 questions in roughly 15 minutes, which are entirely about the future of the learning and development profession.
Well, you know, I'm an optimist.
Nothing if not ambitious, Jez. Okay, so look, we've already had the discussion and going on the first one here. Is it time for L&D to rethink its role and contributions to supporting business performance? And the answer from what we've got here in the chat is already yes, it is. Just Edwin's point, he's just saying, great webinar. As a former operations manager, we were measured primarily on productivity, performance, and quality. I always did the on-the-job training myself, using experts in the team, used the LMS to support it. What impacted us most was the company's performance. So it absolutely an operationally driven approach to it, which perhaps is something more that L&D should be doing, combined with that strategic view. I think Kathy summed it up very well. She said, look, with the emerging ease of content creation with Gen AI and the lack of L&D principles and knowledge elsewhere, I feel this problem, which is what you were describing, is only going to escalate. Everyone chipped in and said, yes. Chantel said, yes, we should be positioning ourselves more as consultants and experts in the how, not the what. Hannah agreed, and Kathy said yes, and we should ensure we go from content consumption and a better focus on embedding the learning experience and measurement. So everyone's agreeing that we need to be rethinking it. And I think actually the very story you tell, that you've got your intervention running alongside the internal L&D department, which was not doing this stuff that was clearly required and was a learning issue. So yes, there is a role there to be taken. My view is looking at what Gen AI does, and it is simply mind-boggling what you can do with Gen AI in terms of creating content. I've been talking to a lot of people about the content backlash, which I think is going to be coming at some point later this year, where people suddenly start, well, not suddenly, but a rising tide of people will say, enough is enough. I've got too much content coming through. Don't give me more content. If L&D sees its role as being producing content, which traditionally it's been in the past, and that comes from a past when content was scarce, it is now not scarce, you have an issue. So our role has to be rethought. I would agree. Andy says L&D doesn't need to own the learning. However, it should be providing direction, consultation, so the culture of business is maintained, and where funding is required, the appropriate solution is delivered to improves performance. Fabulous. Well, I think I would agree with Andy on that one. I chaired a morning of sessions here in Paris yesterday, where people were saying a lot of the similar stuff around we need to change what we're doing. My question to you, Jez, is do you think, and my question to everyone in the room as well, I'd love your comments on this in the general chat. Do you think L&D is able to do this? Do you think we're ready to make the change that's required?
Do you know, I've been thinking about that myself, and I've been around it a long time, and I think how have I got to where I've got? If I put myself in, I can only talk for myself. I've come from the position where learning for me is about the individual. It has to be about the individual. How do we, as organizational learning development, empower and enable individuals to get what they need to do the job that they need to do in a way that they want to do it? We can lead a horse to water and all that. And how do you create a structure around that? Now, I think the problem we've got is that a lot of people, I'm not going to say everybody, but a lot of people in our profession understand that and can associate with that. The reality of it is that we have management, we have management structures, we have management responsibilities, we have information we have to generate and deliver. We've got masses of content that we have to deliver, which sort of erodes that whole principle about individualization, that whole principle about driving learning to the learner. So I think we are ready. If we've got the skills to do that, if we have time to develop those skills and develop those mindsets, I'm not sure. I'm not sure if organizations still are driving us towards content first, delivery second, evaluation third, reflection on what works. Not at all. I'm a bit cynical, and maybe that's just my age, but I am a little bit cynical.
I'm probably the same age as you, Jez, if not slightly older, having been in this field for all of my working life. I think that the people in this room who've decided to come on, dedicate an hour of their working day to being with us today can do it, because the attitude is there and is ready for it. But there's a distribution. It's a normal curve, and actually Annette earlier said, oh yes, the bell curve. I suffered from those in the past. There's a bell curve. Some people are going to make the change. Some people will be changed, and other people will find that change happens to them or they become irrelevant. So I think the answer is it varies. Look, there's lots of good stuff coming on, and I'm sort of peering into my laptop here, trying to catch up with the great thoughts coming through. Kathy says we can. I'm assuming Kathy means we can change, but only with the support of other HR pillars like leadership development and culture, who together can build an environment to enable the capacity to learn. And I think that's a really good point from Kathy. If we try to do everything ourselves, and there's a tendency for L&D to do this, if we try and do everything ourselves, we will fail. It has to be done through relationships. And it's something Andy pointed out earlier on, that relationships, conversations, and value is what will make us successful.
Yeah.
For me, this is about getting out of what I've called in the past the training ghetto. It's sort of a corner where we exist and we do things differently from everybody else. And we have to come out of that and be part of the organization. Right.
And just to on that point, I think for me the shift certainly in my career has been when I stopped thinking myself as a internal support mechanism to being a consultant. And okay, I've ended up being a consultant, but you know, it is that shift. It's that shift away from actually you're there to advise and you're there to guide. You're there to provide your expertise, but you're not there to own and control. And it's that difference which I think has made a fundamental difference to some of the people that I've worked with, in terms of some of the clients that I've worked with over the years. That we don't own stuff. You know, L&D isn't there to own stuff. It's there to empower, enable, and equip.
Part of the reason for that, I think, is the historical origins of learning and development. If I look back to my past in the 1980s and 1990s as a classroom trainer, when the only way you got information was either through books or going to listen to somebody talking about something, there was the reality that learning and development was a bottleneck, that it did control the supply of information, and also it quite liked it. To be honest, if you're in front of a classroom of people and you know more than other people and you're telling them it and they're hanging on your every word, I can only speak for myself. Yeah, it's kind of nice, right? You feel like you're somebody special. I'm not suggesting that people in the room feel that way. I'm not suggesting that everybody feels that way, but I think it's a historical legacy that we've got. But the world is not like that. As I said earlier, content has gone from being scarce to being super abundant. And I think that transition. Sorry, Jez.
I was just going to say, and I think in some ways it's about how we manage that content and how we understand that content. And you know, it's not, the content issue isn't going to go away. Even the platform that I've been working on, you know, as it's developed and grown, the content is growing rapidly, and it's about actually how do you help people make sense of that content? How do you create the framework to use the content effectively as learners? Because learners have got, I mean, this client, their learners have massively limited and managed time during their working day to learn. You know, they don't have much time, they don't have much space. So that learning has to work. It has to be spot on. It has to be delivered easily at a place and time when they need it most. And I think that we as L&D have a responsibility now to provide that framework around content. And I'm not saying we own the content, but we have to be able to curate that content. And I know that curation is a word that appeared a few years ago and has sort of disappeared. But in my head, we are curators, and we have to be those curators in the true sense of the word, you know, in the true how a library or an art gallery curator would work.
It's not the only thing we do. It's not the only thing we do, but it is a crucial part of what we do. Max,
absolutely.
Okay, Max, I'm jumping around because we've got 5 minutes left, and there's such a rich conversation going in all sorts of places. And I'm gonna jump over now to the Q&A bit, because I think that's actually where we deserve to honour the fact that people have put questions in here.
We do.
Max raised let's go to the Q&A now. Max raised a really good point about skills before we jump to questions, saying we need to be focusing on, and he put it, and I'll paraphrase, short-term and long-term skills. Short-term performance, I would say, long-term capability, identifying those and working with the business rather than being providers of content. I completely agree. Any thoughts though, Jez? Because we know skills is a huge issue. Everyone's talking about it at the moment. There are two things people are talking about: skills and AI. Is it a simple matter to identify those skills? What's the possible issues on the way? If you can solve all of that in 30 seconds, we'll jump onto the questions.
Thanks. Yeah, thank you for that. I mean, I came through the world of the competency models and competency frameworks, and the nightmare that created in terms of how do you corral and manage content to fit everybody's needs and everybody's requirements. I don't think there's a quick fix to that. I think what we can do is we can use pathways, we can use journeys, we can use programs, we can be systematic in what the core knowledge needs to be around particular functions, around particular outputs. But I think it's very difficult once we start to get into it, to the true individualization of learning. And that's where we need to be able to empower people to make some choices for themselves and guide them in the right way as learners towards content which is going to work for them, and give them the choices on the type of content that they access, because as we all know, we all learn differently. The problem with digital is that we are sort of corralled in and channeled into a particular approach based on the functionality of the digital, what's available.
We could talk about skills, and we will at various webinars in the future at great length. But that's great. Look, can I say very quickly before we wrap up? I'm going to jump to the questions. Isn't it great hanging out with Jez and just having a grown-up conversation about this stuff? I'm loving it. Right. Quickly jumping over to the questions which I put into the box. Okay, we answered Wendy, Andy, Linda. Now, what about content? Emma was asking, did NetX develop all the content? And somebody else said, what about user-generated? Esther asked, what about user-generated content? Where did it come from?
Okay, I don't want to plug NetX indirectly or directly. The content did through the factory, the content factory, which I talked about, which is templated content, did all come from them. How it worked was the client and their customer, if you like, generated learning objectives, did the content mapping, did some rudimentary storyboarding, and then handed it over to our design team, and then we templated it. And the turnover was really quick, really fast. But the limiting factor to that, it's pretty flat content. It's not great. It's not brilliant, but it does a job.
Well, hang on. You say it's not great. If it does a job, how is it not great? If it's doing the job.
From a learner point of view, it's not the most engaging experience, should we say. Once they've done it a few times and they've seen the same template, it's the same thing. You know, it's not using the range of modalities that we've got. And that's where we're headed now, is looking at different ranges of modalities.
Spicing it up a bit. Esther asks, were there any tangible measures of success in business outcomes, like speed to competency and so on?
No. You know, not in. I mean, yes and no. The client operates a particular model of learner satisfaction, which I think is something that they need to do more of. So Esther's absolutely bang on. It's the right question to ask. It's the question I'm asking them now, but they're not sophisticated enough yet to get to that point.
You said they've got a metric, and what the metric is what?
They use net promoter scoring, which I'm not.
So I'm not a fan of either. But here's the thing I'd say. They have a metric.
They do have a metric, yes,
and they have the metric, and that's going the right direction. So you're meeting the initial business need. We all know that if you go to somebody and say, "Hey, that thing you're trying to achieve is wrong. I can show you the right thing." It's an uphill battle, especially if you're trying to do other change as well. So you've changed an awful lot. You haven't changed that. You've had that in the right direction.
And I think the reality of it is now that, in terms of, like, I don't know about the speed to competency, but I do know that people are doing what they need to do on the shop floor.
Okay.
You know, and that's their key measure, is actually, do they get out of the door what they need to get out of the door when it needs to get out of the door.
Okay, well, that's the business outcome for operations, is, are you doing what you need to do?
Yeah,
they're doing it.
Exactly.
All right. We are at time. It has been fabulous, Jez, chatting as always. And I want to thank everybody in the room for throwing in these really interesting questions and thoughts, and sharing everything like that, because as we said at the beginning, together we are more powerful than any of us individually. And I love the consensus here about the need to change. And it's all been stimulated by the wonderful Jez Addison coming to us from NetX today. So big thank you to everybody in the room. A big thank you to Jez. Simon says, brilliant brain food for a grey Thursday morning. I love that idea of brain food. The link will come through to you tomorrow with the recording of this, and the contacts are on the left-hand side if you want to link in with Jez, link in with me. A number of people were also saying that they wanted to get in contact with each other. Please do feel free to do that. Just look at the name, get in touch with them via LinkedIn. If you want to get in touch with me on LinkedIn, of course, and share your problems, I'm here to serve you and to help change the profession for the better, and each individual on that journey. So look, thank you very much, everyone in the room. And once again, thank you very much to Jez. I will see you at 12 o'clock UK time, 1 o'clock French time, when I will be back hosting myself and Egle Vinelskaite. We're going to be talking about AI in learning and development in 2024, because we haven't mentioned AI for about 30 seconds. And So it's time to bring it up again. But that's 1 hour's time. Just going to wrap up again by saying, Jez, thank you once again. Great session. Really enjoyed it.
My pleasure. Have a good day, everybody. Thank you.